It wasn't Vietnam, but for a generation of white soldiers fighting in the African bush, it felt exactly like it. In the blazing sun and the shadowy forests of southern Africa, a war raged that the world barely noticed, a war fought not just with guns, but with identities. It was a last stand of a colonial minority, a desperate attempt to turn back history's tide, and it failed. The Rhodesian Bush War was one of the 20th century's most complex and haunting conflicts, fought between a white minority regime and two rival black nationalist movements. It would reshape the region, echo through neighboring states, and offer a preview of the brutal post-colonial struggles to come. Why did Rhodesia fight so hard to preserve a status quo the world had already condemned? And what happens when a country chooses to stand against history itself? To understand the Bush War, we must first understand Rhodesia. In 1965, the world was stunned when a small country in southern Africa declared itself independent not from colonial rule, but in defiance of its end. The white minority government of southern Rhodesia, led by Prime Minister Ian Smith, unilaterally declared independence from Britain. It was the first time a colony had tried to preserve white rule after decolonization had begun sweeping across Africa. The act was condemned globally. The United Nations branded it illegal. Britain refused to recognize the new regime. Economic sanctions followed swiftly. But inside Rhodesia, the white settlers believed they had little choice. For decades, white Rhodesians, descendants of British and Boer colonists, had built a privileged society atop a deeply segregated system. They owned the land, controlled the economy, and dominated the government. Despite making up only about 5% of the population, to them, black majority rule meant chaos. It meant losing everything: property, power, even life. The memory of the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya still haunted colonial minds. The chaos of the Belgian Congo, where white civilians had been slaughtered during the decolonization process, was often cited as a warning, so they chose defiance. Ian Smith famously declared that there would be no majority rule in Rhodesia in my lifetime. That sentence would come to haunt him and define a war. But even before UDI, the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, the seeds of conflict were growing. Two black nationalist movements had begun to form in the 1960s. The Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, led by Joshua Nkomo, and later the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, led by Robert Mugabe. Both sought to overthrow the white regime. Both initially tried peaceful protests and appeals to Britain, but as Rhodesia dug in, the militants took to the bush, and the bush would soon become a battlefield. Chapter 2: A War Without Front Lines. The Rhodesian Bush War, also known as the Second Chimurenga, borrowing the Shona word for revolution, began in earnest in the late 1960s. But it was in the 1970s that it exploded into a full-scale insurgency. What made this war different was its nature. There were no clear front lines, no trenches, no grand offensives. This was a war of ambushes and landmines, of helicopters and tripwires, of terror and counter-terror. The Rhodesian army, well-trained and heavily armed, tried to fight like a Western military. But their enemies didn't play by those rules. Guerrillas from ZANU's military wing, ZANLA and ZAPU's ZIPRA forces operated in cells, striking quickly and disappearing into the bush. They attacked farms, railways, police stations. They planted landmines on country roads and assassinated collaborators, and they were supported by a vast underground network among rural black populations. The Rhodesians responded with brutal efficiency. Elite units like the Sela Scouts infiltrated guerrilla ranks, posed as insurgents, and carried out assassinations, Fire Force units, fast reaction helicopter squads rained death from above with terrifying speed. Civilians were often caught in the crossfire or targeted directly. Villages suspected of harboring guerrillas were burned. Suspected informants disappeared. Torture, executions, and massacres became routine on all sides. The war was savage, but beneath the gunfire was something deeper, a battle over identity. Rhodesia wasn't just fighting insurgents. It was fighting the world's judgment. It was fighting history's verdict. And it was slowly, painfully, losing. As the 1970s wore on, the Rhodesian Bush War was no longer just a civil war. It had become a global proxy, an unspoken front in the Cold War. Though unrecognized by most nations, Rhodesia found tacit support in strange places. South Africa, itself under apartheid rule, quietly funneled resources and advisors to its northern neighbor, ZANU did Portugal, until the fall of its own colonial empire in Mozambique in 1975. But it was the backing of China and the Soviet Union for the guerrilla movements that truly internationalized the conflict. ZANU, led by Robert Mugabe, aligned itself with Maoist China. Guerrillas trained in Beijing, returning to Zimbabwe with revolutionary doctrine and light arms. Their warfare was ideological, as much as tactical, built on the belief that rural peasants could be the engine of revolution. ZAPU, under Joshua Nkomo, received support from the Soviet bloc. ZIPRA fighters were trained in conventional tactics, often forming more structured, larger units, some even with armored vehicles and anti-air weapons by the war's later years. As a result, the Bush War began to take on a split personality. A Maoist insurgency in the east, backed by China, and a Soviet-style rebel army in the west. Rhodesia now faced two enemies, each with different doctrines, different backers, and different visions for post-independent Zimbabwe. Meanwhile, Western powers watched with discomfort. Britain, unwilling to reoccupy a rogue colony, offered diplomatic pressure, but little more. The United States, under Nixon and later Ford, quietly tolerated Rhodesia as a lesser evil compared to the spread of Soviet influence, but time was not on the regime's side. The year 1975 changed everything. Portugal, reeling from a revolution at home, abruptly ended its colonial wars in Africa. Mozambique and Angola, Rhodesia's eastern and western neighbors, became independent under Marxist governments almost overnight. What had once been Rhodesia's protective buffer became a guerrilla sanctuary. ZANU fighters now flowed freely across the Mozambique border. ZIPRA guerrillas trained in Angola with Cuban support. The entire regional map had shifted and Rhodesia found itself encircled. The Rhodesian government responded with ferocity. Cross-border raids into Mozambique and Zambia became routine. Guerrilla bases were bombed, sometimes deep into foreign territory. Civilians were killed, fueling international outrage. But the insurgents kept coming, and their numbers kept growing. By the late 1970s, the white minority regime was bleeding financially, militarily, morally. Conscription had become universal for white males, some as young as 17. Farm families lived under constant fear of ambush. Economic sanctions in place for over a decade had crippled industry and isolated Rhodesia diplomatically. But still, Ian Smith refused to concede. He believed Rhodesia could outlast the insurgents. He believed, despite all signs, that the world might eventually come around. He was wrong. By 1978, the war was no longer confined to the borderlands. Guerrilla forces began launching coordinated attacks inside Rhodesian cities. Police stations were bombed, rail lines sabotaged, Even passenger aircraft were shot down, including Air Rhodesia Flight 825, destroyed by a Zipra missile in 1978, killing 48 civilians. Survivors on the ground were executed by guerrillas. The horror shocked the nation and radicalized the conflict further. Rhodesia intensified its counterinsurgency. More civilians were detained. More villages were razed. But it was too late. The war was being lost, not only on the battlefield, but in the minds of the population. Many white Rhodesians began to leave. Immigration soared. Morale among troops declined. Young white men questioned the purpose of a war that had no end in sight. Black Rhodesians, meanwhile, grew bolder, their support for the insurgents deepening as the war eroded faith in the system. In the rural areas, ZANU and ZAPU effectively replaced the state. They held shadow courts, collected taxes, enforced discipline, sometimes brutally. It was no longer about reform. It was about revolution. And Rhodesia's time was running out. The war entered its 15th year. The international community began to exert serious pressure. It was no longer just about Rhodesia. South Africa, the last major supporter of Ian Smith's regime, had begun to waver, fearing isolation. Pretoria encouraged a diplomatic solution. Britain, under the new conservative government of Margaret Thatcher, saw an opportunity to reclaim moral authority in the post-imperial world. The stage was set in late 1979 in an unlikely location, Lancaster House, London. There, representatives of the Rhodesian government, the black nationalist movements, and the British Crown gathered to negotiate what would become a watershed moment, the Lancaster House Agreement. But it was no simple deal. Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo came to the table with deep suspicions and fresh blood on their hands. Ian Smith and his internal allies, meanwhile, demanded guarantees for white property and legal protections for a dwindling minority. Months of tense diplomacy followed: shuttle negotiations, walkouts, secret side talks. Eventually, under mounting military pressure and diplomatic isolation, Smith's successor, Bishop Abel Muzorewa, the figurehead of a failed internal settlement, agreed to new elections under British oversight. For the first time in history, Rhodesia would vote as Zimbabwe, and black majority rule would finally arrive. But it was a fragile peace, and the legacy of war hung heavy. In March 1980, elections were held. Despite British hopes for a moderate victory, the results were overwhelming. Robert Mugabe, leader of ZANU and former guerrilla commander, swept to power. To the surprise of many, Mugabe preached reconciliation. White farmers were urged to stay. Former enemies shook hands. The country was renamed Zimbabwe, and international recognition poured in. For a brief moment, it felt like a miracle. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. The rivalry between ZANU and ZAPU, barely concealed during the war, now threatened to explode. ZIPRA forces, still armed, clashed with ZANU elements. In 1983, the illusion shattered when Mugabe unleashed a brutal crackdown in Matabeleland, ZAPU's stronghold, resulting in thousands of civilian deaths. The operation, carried out by the infamous 5th Brigade, became known as the Gukurahundi, the early rain that washes away the chaff. The Bush War was over, but the violence had not ended. Instead, it had simply changed form. Rhodesia died in 1980, but the questions it posed still linger. Can a nation built on inequality survive reform without violence? Can war truly end when justice is delayed? And what becomes of those who fight when peace arrives, not as vindication, but as erasure for the white Rhodesians who fled to South Africa, to Australia, to Britain. The war became a memory both bitter and mythologized. Some still speak of the good old days. Others remember only the fear, the mines, the flames. For Black Zimbabweans, the war promised liberation, but delivered hardship. Mugabe would rule for nearly 4 decades, his legacy tarnished by economic collapse, political repression, and stolen elections. The revolution devoured its own children, and the Bush, once alive with gunfire and dreams, grew quiet again but never forgetful. History does not end when the guns fall silent. It mutates, hardens, and returns in other forms. For decades after independence, Zimbabwe seemed caught in a strange limbo, a nation born of revolution. But imprisoned by it, the war had changed everything, but not always for the better. Robert Mugabe, once hailed as a liberator, increasingly ruled like a monarch. Land reform, long delayed to appease Western donors, finally came in the form of violent seizures in the early 2000s. White farmers were expelled, often brutally. The economy collapsed. Hyperinflation spiraled out of control. By 2008, Zimbabwe's currency had become a global punchline. Its $100 trillion notes, a symbol of national trauma. But beneath this economic ruin lay something deeper: the scars of the Bush War, a society that had been militarized, never fully demobilized. Former guerrillas became ruling elites. Dissent was treated not as democratic discourse, but as betrayal. Elections were rigged. Opposition was crushed. The same logic of war, us versus them. Loyalty or death was never quite left behind. And yet, in the dream of Zimbabwe never fully died either. The memory of struggle of peasants who faced napalm, of mothers who hid fighters under floorboards, of teenage boys who marched barefoot into history still burns in the national consciousness. It is a complicated pride, but it is real. Rhodesia is gone, but its ghost haunts the region still. The Rhodesian Bush War never had a day. No Berlin Wall fell. No general signed unconditional surrender in a grand hall. Its ending came in the bush, whispered, brutal, half forgotten, but its lessons remain urgent. It showed what happens when a minority clings to power through force, blind to the tides of history. It warned of the perils of revolution, that liberation does not guarantee justice, and that the line between freedom fighter and tyrant can vanish in the heat of power. And it left us with a cruel irony that the war to end white rule in Zimbabwe did not free all Zimbabweans, that sometimes the true battle begins after the last shot is fired. Thank you for watching Legacy Files. If this story moved you, challenged your assumptions, or taught you something new, consider subscribing. Every subscription helps us bring more untold histories to light.